Okay, today's video is going to be rather rapid. And this is an area where it's good to create some flashcards because we're going to talk about different structures, different parts of the nervous system and what they do, and different parts of the brain and what they do. Also, we'll be talking about ways of studying the brain. This video will probably be a little longer than some of the others. There's just more information, and this is why we're spending 2 weeks on this particular chapter. There's a lot in it. Okay, so the nervous system is divided into two major branches. The central nervous system, which is in the central part of your body, it's just your brain and spinal cord. Everything else is the peripheral nervous system. It goes out to your toes and your legs and your fingers and your arms, all that. So the two main branches are the central and the peripheral, just like peripheral vision out to the side, peripheral nervous system out to the side. Here is a chart, and you see the first two divisions, but then the peripheral nervous system is further divided into additional components. One is called the somatic nervous system, and that's the part that innervates our voluntary muscles, like in our fingers and hands and arms. So we can say, okay, I'm moving my hand here and I'm doing this, I'm going to scratch my head. The other is called the autonomic, but it sounds like automatic, so that helps us understand it. And it's responsible for survival because it's further, it does all our internal organs, but it also does our fight, flight, or flee response. So if you ever get into a crisis situation, like I was almost attacked by a dog, actually the dog came barking up at me, and you know what happens when you get in a crisis like that? Your sympathetic nervous system gets active. This particular picture, you can see on the left-hand side of this body picture that your pupils get really big. So you can take in all the information that could be a threat to you. Your heart starts to increase, and so it gets the blood to your muscles so you can move. You don't need to digest food when you're in a crisis, so that just shuts down. You do release sugar so that you can have fuel to fight or run or take care of yourself. Also, it's in these different parts of the nervous system are involved in the sexual response. So the sympathetic nervous response is responsible for orgasm, and then the parasympathetic is responsible for excitement. And we'll get more to that in chapter 10. So we go back up, you see the parasympathetic is what happens when we're in a calm state. So after you eat a big meal, and like you can think about Thanksgiving or just hanging out, it's the opposite of what happens. You can see on the right here that basically your pupils constrict because you don't need to take in information. Your heart rate slows. Actually, that's when digestion needs to happen. So that is when you're storing up food and calories and fat so that when you come to a crisis later on, you can use those resources, those reserves. So those are the major different branches. I'm going to talk about ways of studying the brain, and then we're going to just go into the central nervous system, basically the brain in depth. Here are the different ways, and I have all of them listed: surgery, accidents, EEGs, and different sorts of imaging. I'll go and walk through these fairly rapidly. The very first one I want to mention, though, is accidents. This is a famous person who's described in your book, 1800s. His name was Phineas Gage. They don't have names like that anymore. He was actually working to blow up rocks so they could put railroad tracks down. And in the process of doing so, he was tapping down on some gunpowder inside a big boulder, a hole in the boulder they had made. But they had forgot to insulate it with sand. And so a spark generated an explosion, which sent this pole they're using to tap down through, you can see his left cheek and up through the top of his head, and the pole shot out. It's like this 8 or 10 foot pole just all the way through his head. What happened to this accident? It cut off the frontal lobe of his brain. That's this part up here. This is really what makes us human. And he survived. Actually, it was bizarre. He ended up being like in a circus. He died being a sideshow in a circus. Saying this is a pole that went through my head. With his accident, what they found was that when he lost his frontal lobe, this is how we know about one of the ways that we know about the brain. It's a case study, basically. He lost the ability to control his emotions. And what we've come to realize is this frontal lobe really helps us manage our emotions. Also helps us to plan for the future. After this accident, he could not project, he couldn't think, what am I going to have for dinner? What am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do next week? None of that was possible. So to plan and to problem solve, we need that. Also, our moral reasoning is up here. This is really, really what makes us human, this frontal lobe of the brain, the frontal part of it. So we know about the brain through accidents, and that's one of the most famous examples. Now we have all sorts of car accidents, and we're still learning more about the brain from those sorts of accidents. EEG is another form of studying the brain. And you can see if you've ever been a sleep study, basically they put these little electrodes, and on the left here, you see it's like, kind of like a skull cap on the outside of the skull. So it's non-invasive, but the goal is to basically measure where are the action potentials happening in the brain, because that's just like a little electrical storm happening in different parts of the brain, and it can roughly measure where that's happening. So an EEG can help us get an idea of what our brain waves are looking like, and what parts of the brain are really active when we're concentrating on different tasks. Some techniques can tell us about structures in the brain: x-rays, CAT scans, MRIs. They can tell us about if there's been a stroke, if there's a tumor. These are important diagnostic tools that we use. So you've probably heard of these three. The other two, we don't want to talk much about PET scan anymore, because it's a little bit more dangerous to use. But the fMRI is critical, because, and that little F in front of there stands for function. And it can tell us where the blood is flowing in the brain. And that's showing us where the action potentials are occurring when we're engaged in certain tasks. So if a person's put in one of those fMRI machines, you've probably seen them. They look like a big, almost like round cylinder. It feels like a person's being buried in a coffin or something. And it's measuring where the blood's going in the brain. And you can have a person play video games, listen to stories, look at complex images like mazes, and figure out what their brain is doing by seeing where the blood flows. So those functional MRIs are fascinating. They tell us what's going on in the brain. This particular study showed where blood was flowing when they were doing research, and marketers do this, when participants were exposed to different television commercials this is for the Super Bowl. And you can see, obviously, the ad for Doritos got a lot more blood flow going on in different parts of the brain, and probably was remembered more. So advertisers are not above trying to directly manipulate us and depart with our money by doing these sort of brain scan studies with people. Okay, I'm going back to the overall branches here. So I'm not going to review all the peripheral nervous system, but the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, is where we're at next. And the brain itself, and the different parts of it and the different lobes, is what I'll just briefly mention. Again, if you can look at that in your book and create flashcards to study this, I think you'd be well. So the hindbrain is the oldest part of the brain. That is the part, as you can see, it's kind of like where the spinal cord comes up into the skull and starts to enlarge. And there are important structures there. The medulla is at the very base of it, and that is responsible for keeping our heart rate going and our breathing. It's so well protected deep within our skulls here that if we do have an accident and bang our head, that medulla is going to keep us breathing, and actually allows us, even when we're in a coma, to cough or sneeze and get rid of obstructions to our air passages. So this is an important structure for our survival. The cerebellum, that is, I kind of covered that up with my own picture. Oops, get back up. That is this little, I got the cursor going here, the little bell-like, so the bell clapper kind of structure at the base of the brain. And this is responsible for a couple different things. This helps us to keep our balance. It allows us to like button buttons and do small muscle movements, playing the piano or playing guitar or something like that. Also, the cerebellum is responsible for classically conditioned memories, which when we get to chapter 6, you'll find out more about what that's about. In the midbrain, we also have a structure that's going up, kind of into the this part of the expansion of the spinal cord up into the skull, called the midbrain. We have the reticular formation, and this part of the brain sends fibers throughout the entire brain. And it's our body's alarm clock. It will alert us. Like if you've been asleep and someone says your name and you kind of come to, that is your reticular formation saying, become alert, we need to have your attention here. Let's see. Also, I want to talk about these different parts of the forebrain. If you look at the thalamus, this is like a switchboard. This is where all sensory processing is done initially, except for our sense of smell. Our sense of smell goes straight to our emotional brain, which is a fascinating idea. But the rest of all the information coming in from our eyes, ears, our mouth, our skin is initially processed by the thalamus and then distributed to the different parts of the brain that can make sense of it. Here's a structure that you're going to read more about, hear more about. It's become very popular in research recently. It's called the amygdala. It's a funny name, amygdala. It's called the amygdala, and it's a really important emotional structure in the brain. It will stamp our memories with anger or fear. It's also kind of an ongoing security system for us, because even without knowing it, unconsciously, we are constantly scanning the environment looking for threats. And we can be talking to somebody else, but if our eyes and our amygdala detect someone coming at us at a lunge, our amygdala will just instantly set off all the alarms and put us on the defense. Also, we have the hypothalamus. This is a structure in the brain that's responsible for our appetites, including for sex, for food, for water when we're thirsty. Also, when we're cold, there's nothing like I need heat, or if when we're really, really hot, it's like I need air conditioning. So these are our body's appetites in there. And it's also, I mean, you have right next to it a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is that pleasure part of the brain. And I'm sure you can guess which neurotransmitter that works with. And that is the dopamine, which we talked about in the last video. All right. Oh, this is a picture of two different rats. And what they found when they were doing studies with these rats, they either, for the hypothalamus, they cut up one section for one rat of the hypothalamus, and if it was given all access to food, it could not stop eating. So the hypothalamus has in it a structure, the basic, that says stop eating. But if you slice it up, that doesn't operate, and a rat will eat till it can't move anymore. Conversely, you slice up another part of the hypothalamus, and you have a rat that cannot initiate the start eating mechanism. And even if they have food in front of them, they'll starve to death. So the hypothalamus, again, animal research studies like this are questionable ethically, but we know things like this based on those sorts of studies. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly then about, we've talked about some of these structures. The limbic system is our emotional brain. So this is what Phineas Gage, when he had his accident, that's all he was operating on. And that involves the hypothalamus, which we just talked about, the amygdala, but also the hippocampus. And hippocampus is our memory kind of transfer station. It compares what we're going through now to things we've lived through in the past and allows us to store away new memories. Adolescents, kids work primarily on these structures. So the frontal lobe that I talked about, Phineas Gage, that allows us to do moral reasoning and planning and problem solving, is not fully formed and connected until about the age of like 22, 23. And then you can get real good solid communication between the limbic system and the forebrain and the frontal lobe. Okay, another way to think about how the brain is divided up, I think of it as continents of the brain, are four major sections. I'd like you to be familiar with these. The frontal lobe, we already know from Phineas Gage, planning, moral reasoning, managing emotions. But also there's a strip in the back of the frontal lobe called the motor cortex. And we have a map of the body that basically will start saying, I need to move my arm like that. And that starts there in the motor cortex, sending messages. Right next to it in the parietal lobe, the next kind of country or continent in the brain, is the sensory cortex. So anytime someone touches your arm, that's going to be sent to a part of the brain where your body's mapped out there. It says someone's touching your arm, someone's touching your head. The parietal lobe processes sensory information. The occipital lobe here in the back, it's strange that it's so far away from your eyes, but that's where visual information, so occipital, like binoculars, ocular, that processes all visual information. So, and you can imagine some animals, like an eagle, it's a huge occipital lobe because they're flying up there, hundreds of feet in the air, and to survive, they have to see a little mouse in a field, and that's how they eat. I mean, they go and like, okay, I gotta catch dinner, basically. And occipital lobe processes all that visual information. The temporal lobe, as you can see, is right above the ears. So as you probably guessed, it does process hearing and information that we need to be able to make sense of spoken words. That is all I have for this section. I hope this has helped.